Did you know that 43% of DevOps teams have to rerun their infrastructure deployments more than 4 times? That's like 3 times more than they should. Spacelift shifts your validations left to detect errors earlier, helping your whole team move faster. Learn more at spacelift.io/day-2. That's DAY-TWO.
Welcome to Day 2 DevOps, where the dev oops is in the details. I'm Kyler Middleton, and on Day 2 DevOps, we explore those details and how you can learn from the mistakes of others and build a solid DevOps and developer experience practice on day 1 and beyond. With me on this journey of learning and doing is my co-host, Ned Bellavance. Hi, Ned.
Hey, Kyler. Today we have a really interesting conversation on the physics of DevOps. What does that mean? Well, I mean, you're going to have to listen to the episode to find out. But the reason we called it the physics of DevOps is because of the scientific methodology that goes behind measuring developer experience. And then we got into a conversation about how AI, because it's 2025 and we have to talk about AI, it's shifting cognitive load to your senior engineers. And Tyler, you had some feelings about this, which I definitely felt and understood. And then we talked about performance and the various frameworks that are out there to measure your developers' performance and productivity. So there's a lot there. Who was helping us through this conversation?
Exactly. Laura Tacho, the CTO of DX, is focusing on how to use this data intelligently to inform developer productivity and platform engineering and study the physics of DevOps. And I don't want to belabor the point, so let's get to it. Laura, thank you so much for being on the show. I ran into some of your work on LinkedIn, and you were talking about the DORA report, which is a report from Google about DevOps practices and things that are going on in the world. And there was some coverage of AI and how it affects developer productivity. And I know that's something that you're studying, and you have some new cool things to share about that. But first of all, let's talk about what is the DORA report? How is it assembled, and what does it contain? What's in there?
Let's start by talking about what DORA is, because DORA is a research body that has started over 10 years ago, initially really focused on like DevOps research and assessment, figuring out organizations that are adopting DevOps practices. What are the organizational benefits that are coming from these practices? Can we actually look at specific DevOps capabilities that are more correlated with organizational performance? And all these questions. And actually, many of you listening, I'm sure probably know of the DORA metrics because of this book right here, Accelerate,
Yep.
which is on my bookshelf. And I honestly, maybe every book is intended to be a reference book, but I find myself even just like now still, I mean, this book was published, in 2018, I think 2017, but reaching for it and calling out parts of the chapters because the physics of what organizations do and what DevOps enables kind of haven't changed. Maybe the tooling has changed. And so the words that we use to describe what we're doing has definitely evolved in the last 10 years, but a lot of the like core mechanics are still there. So I think the book is still really helpful for a lot of conversations that I have. But this is the book that kind of put the DORA metrics on the map. And most people think of like the 4 key DORA metrics. I don't want to quiz you, Ned, Kyler, but do you remember what they are?
I do not.
Before we get into that, I just want to call out I love that you refer to it as the physics of sort of software development and that sort of science based approach of asking interesting questions, coming up with a hypothesis, and then testing that hypothesis against actual data.
Mhm.
I read the book too, and that was the thing that I loved about it is how grounded in science and research it is.
I think that's the one thing that DORA has really revolutionized when it comes to our understanding, or even like the layman's understanding of software development. Maybe not a layman, a practitioner's understanding of it. You know, we can think about sort of the stereotype of works on my machine and all of these like really individual, like single snowflake environments and things that are really one off. And oh, well, my company, it can't be like that because we have to do this and my company's like this. And DORA really did apply, as you said, this like really methodical, scientific research back approach to studying organizations and their wiring and the physics of everything, and found like actually, regardless of your industry, your sector, how old your company is, tenure of your employees, like these things hold true. And don't use oh, we're in a highly regulated industry as an excuse not to strive for improving, because we have data and research that shows that, you know, these things kind of globally apply. The physics don't change in a lot of cases. Yeah, anyway, so back to the 4 DORA metrics. It's kind of what put DORA on the map, right? We have deployment frequency, change failure rate, mean time to recover, which we now call time to recover from a failed deployment, and then lead time to change, which is basically like I have a change that's ready to go to a customer. How long does it take to actually get to a customer? And so these 4 metrics have kind of driven the conversation effectively for the last decade. And each year, DORA puts out, first of all, a survey. They're collecting all of this data from organizations, like so many different dimensions of how their teams operate, how their organization operates, what tools they use, what practices they use. And then this all gets summarized in a yearly report, which is the State of DevOps report. And you can read these. It's like a little time capsule of software development practices and DevOps practices. It's really enjoyable to go back to like 2018 and think, oh man, I remember when companies were still struggling to adopt containerization. I remember when everyone was very into Kubernetes and like now no one wants to manage Kubernetes themselves, and like kind of see how these trends change. And so naturally, the last report from 2024 was really focused on AI, of course, but lots of other stuff as well.
That's fascinating. First of all, the point that you made earlier that this is using the scientific method to kind of boil down the shared physics, the shared experience, the shared processes of what DevOps means to every organization. And that's certainly not how I normally think about DevOps or talk about DevOps. I don't think it's a science that's shared and provable. I think it's an idea that's flitting away and every organization defines it differently. And that's very interesting to try and encapsulate it and describe it with scientific methods.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty cool, first of all. But second of all, let's talk about what Dora talked about in terms of AI, because we're legally obligated to ask about AI during each of these podcast sessions every time. And it's personally just fascinating.
Yeah, I'm legally obligated to have an opinion about it. So I guess that works for both of us.
We require it for our guests. So, what did Dora say about AI, especially related to that, the scientific underpinnings of it, the physics of DevOps?
Yeah, what's so interesting is that we can call it a hype cycle, we can call it overpromising. I think it's just like the market's really optimistic, right? We have this brand new thing that's like a total paradigm shift. I feel at times that it's sort of like the same excitement as like when Docker hit the scene and then all of a
Mm,
sudden containers, and it like really changed the game. It like changed how an everyday developer got their work done. And there's not a lot of things that change where the work is getting done, how the coding is actually happening, and how local development is happening, and how deployments are happening like Docker did. I mean, AI is doing the same. And so I think, I kind of think about like the buzz cycle as well. And maybe you've talked about that on the podcast before, sort of the rise and fall and then emerging from the ashes of the Docker story, because they were valued at $1 billion on like day 2 of their company or something. I mean, it wasn't that's an exaggeration, but like there was a lot of optimism. And I was like, I mean, I was right there in the center of it as well. Like we really thought it was going to change everything, and it did. It just didn't happen in ways that we maybe predicted at first. And I think AI kind
mhm.
of has that similar, you could call it a hype cycle, but that similar optimism. Like this is a huge paradigm shift. So in the DORA report, what we're trying to figure out is like, let's actually study the organizations who are early adopters and like early majority of using AI tools for their coding tasks, and try to figure out what are the differences in organizational outcomes, what are the differences in satisfaction, burnout, other areas of performance for the individual teams. So wanting to know individual performance, team performance, and organizational performance, how is AI affecting all of these things? And if you can scroll through LinkedIn and see whoever is posting about like, oh yeah, AI is going to eliminate all the developers. You can have $1 billion startup just yourself. I mean, there's a lot of wacky things that people are saying about AI.
Mhm.
But truth be told, when we look at populations of developers and organizations that are actually using it, we see in some cases some worse outcomes organizationally.
Hmm.
Even if individually a developer feels that they are, more productive, have a lower cognitive load for using the AI tools, that doesn't always translate into 10x profits for the organization. And so for the last 2 DORA reports, there's been sort of this like contrarian tension between what DORA finds in their research methodology versus what research funded by maybe a different entity or funded by an AI tool might be reporting from their studies. It doesn't mean that either of them is wrong. And I want to be really clear about that, because I think that can come across as sounding like, oh, the AI tools are just like hyping up their own results. But we're looking at really different populations here.
Mhm.
and they're self-selecting populations. And so it's possible that both of them are accurate and correct. We just have to understand what are the demographics. And any good research study is going to show you demographics and firmographics, usually at the end. Look for it there so you can kind of understand the context.
I love that you brought up look towards the end of the report for the actual demographics that were used for a study because that has such a huge influence on the findings of the study.
Mhm.
If you went and talked to 1,000 SMBs and the developers at those SMBs, they're going to have a very different experience with AI than if you talked to 500 enterprise companies of 10,000 employees or more, because what happens at the individual developer level might be similar, but then what happens at the team level is going to be vastly different.
Yeah.
Mhm.
100%. And I think the DORA report, when you look at the firmographics, there's a huge spectrum of representation there. And, we've focused on the coding task to start with. And that does look really different, as you said, for an enterprise developer working with 25-year-old systems versus a 15-person startup, seeing 10x productivity gains.
Right.
There's really different contexts that these populations are operating in.
I know my own personal experience with AI is I'm in the sort of enterprise space mostly. I don't consult so much anymore. I'm just reviewing a lot of code. As you get more senior, you're reading everybody else's code all the time and trying to steer the ship, and it's a challenge. And AI has made it quite a bit more challenging. I mean, first of all, the volume of code is just tremendously higher. I'm reviewing so many more lines of code, and often the code is sort of poorly understood by the folks that are submitting it.
Hmm.
So when I push back on pull requests, which of course you're supposed to do, like, why did you do it this way? There's this other standard used in the rest of the code. Before AI, folks would say, like, oh, I Googled it. Oh, I copied that. I see. I'll go fix it. And in the advent of AI, we're now having like, oh, I don't know why I did that. I didn't do that. Was the other guy. That was the AI thing that did that. I didn't program that because working with AI is just so much more like mob programming than it is like individual programming. And I'm just having to have so much of a higher cognitive load as the senior that's reading all the code to just keep everything together, keep it compatible, keep it readable, keep it all the things that matter to an enterprise. Whereas if you're a consultant, you just want it to work, meet the statement of work and then you're done. See you later. Call me in a year or two when it breaks and I'll come fix it. But an enterprise, like, readability and maintainability is so much more critical. And I think that's where AI falls short. That's my experience of AI just not meeting what I need it to do for an enterprise circumstance.
Yeah, I think that's such an insightful point to bring up about the volume of code being really one of the levers that's moving the most. Because in State of DevOps report from 2024, we saw like worse organizational outcomes in some circumstances, and quality is a big part of that. But if you think about what AI enables you to do, it enables you to write a higher volume of code more quickly. And previous DORA research has already showed us that more code is more risky. Bigger batch sizes are riskier. Small batch size is less risky. And so what's happening is like the hypothesis of why this is happening is because the batch sizes are increasing.
Mhm.
And we know when batch sizes increase, quality decreases because risk increases. And so it's not that fundamentally the code that's being authored by AI is of lower quality. It's that it's changing the workflow where we're straying from some of those key components that we understood to be, good for the organization, good for the team, good for the individual, and kind of taking 2 steps forward, but 1 step backward in terms of our progress there. And I think that's going to be very interesting to see in 2025 what's happening and how this has all evolved because it's changing also so quickly.
The dynamic sort of seems like we're borrowing cognitive load from our senior engineers, for our juniors. And like, that's great for the juniors. They're able to write a lot of code. Their output is so much higher. That looks great. But for the seniors, you are reading so much code in each pull request. There, 1,000 lines of code PRs are not uncommon anymore. And that is so bizarre. That's so different than 2 years ago when we weren't, using this in the enterprise. And now there's 20 comments and 5 different turns of like, oh, hey, I updated it. And I'm like, oh, great, I get to read 1,000 lines of code again. It's just much more challenging.
Yeah. Anyone who's listening to this who is trying to put together a business case to measure the ROI of AI coding assistance, listen to what Kyler said, because you're right that we're borrowing time. We're taking out a loan from our future selves, or maybe we're redistributing the cognitive load from senior to junior, because we might look at how much time did we save on the coding task and then come up with an ROI based on the time saved of the coding task. But when we don't also factor in, did we save time for reviewing? Did we save time on everything else? We have to look at the whole development lifecycle from start to finish and its impact on that, and not just get too narrow on one part of the place. And that's where I see a lot of companies kind of stumble a little bit because they see that the coding task is taking less time because we're accelerated, right? We have AI tools helping us author code or helping us find documentation or whatever it is that's causing friction. Maybe we can get rid of it. But we might see swells in time spent in reviewing, or now we have all this back and forth on PR review because where we used to pair, we don't pair anymore because now we have a coding assistant. And so there's all these different circumstances where we have to look at this really, really comprehensively from start to finish and not get too narrow on just one of the parts because we risk losing sight of the system performance as a whole.
I wanted to pivot over to a framework that you've been working on because I know you brought that up in our pre planning call. Can you tell us a little bit about the framework that you're working on and how that sort of intersects with what DORA is doing?
Yeah, so DORA is a really powerful framework, really well balanced, and kind of for a lot of organizations, the gold standard for measuring software deployment capabilities.
Hmm.
I will never encourage anyone to not use the four key DORA metrics. And I think DORA does this amazing, all this research that they have and give access to understand how organizations operate. And the physics of everything is so helpful. DORA is focused really on software delivery capabilities. So, can you get code from a local development environment to a customer? But it's not necessarily focusing on whether that code is useful for the customer. It's not focusing on generally the balance of what kinds of work are being done on teams. It's not focusing a lot on the developer experience of the code authoring. It's more focused on the developer experience of the deployment mechanisms. And so, I work in developer productivity. I've been working on developer tools for the last 15 years, all the way from infrastructure as a service, HP Cloud, back when there was a public cloud, to like really riding the Docker wave and doing a lot of work with Docker, working in CI/CD. And now I've landed at DX, which is a developer intelligence platform where we're able to stitch together both workflow data about systems with qualitative data, self-reported data from engineers. So you get a better picture and insight into developer experience. Even though DORA exists, even though the space framework of developer productivity exists, the DevEx framework exists, I still get asked all the time, what should we actually be measuring to measure developer productivity? Because even DORA is the four key metrics, they measure a really specific amount, and there's just still a need to measure outside of those four metrics, which are focused on the delivery capabilities, in order to get a full picture of developer productivity. And before, the answer was just like, it depends. So what we decided to do was, I mean, right, isn't like every answer in software engineering is like, it depends. Well, it depends.
Always the answer. Yeah.
Mhm.
And so what we did was like myself, Abi Noda, who's a co-author of the DevEx framework, got together along with Nicole Forsgren, Peggy Story, who's the co-author of Space. Nicole obviously is the founder of DORA, and a few other researchers that worked on Space and DevEx. And we kind of put our heads together and said, if we were to release strict guidance, not so strict, but if we were to release guidance and a list of metrics of what to measure, what would be on that list? And that's what the Core 4 framework is. It's unifying all of these different frameworks that I think to someone who doesn't spend all of their time thinking about developer productivity, like I do, might seem unrelated and might seem competing. And we wanted to just answer the question, what should we actually be measuring, and show that these are very complementary frameworks. So the work that DORA has done fits very nicely with the Space framework of developer productivity, which was released in 2021, which fits really nicely with the DevEx framework, which is focusing more on the qualities and characteristics of software engineering teams that are more productive. And we can kind of stitch these all together and unify them. And now we have the benefit of time and field experience and more research, and give you a list of metrics basically to start with, so that you're not chasing your tail, trying to figure out or brute force the problem of like, what should we measure? What's actually useful? And focus more on the transformation, actually using data to make decisions, because that's where it gets really, really hard really quickly.
What kind of questions would the DevEx framework help me to answer? Like if I have a question in my mind and I should turn to the DevEx framework to help me answer that question.
Are you asking about DevEx framework or the Core 4?
Okay, so maybe a point of disambiguation there.
Yeah, yeah.
What's the core 4 versus the DevEx framework?
Sure. I'll give you sort of the super like drive by of popular developer productivity frameworks.
Okay.
Okay, so we've been talking about DORA, and DORA are these four key metrics that focus really on software delivery capabilities. This was research that was coming out. I mean, if you think about what was the world like when you picked up this bad boy for the first time, Accelerate. I know I was working at CloudBees. I was working on like CI/CD. We were really working with a lot of organizations who had like heard of trunk-based development and we're like curious, like what is this? CI/CD, we're automating stuff, we're moving to the cloud. Like this is all very exciting. But that's the context that Accelerate came out. And again, like the physics of this stuff is evergreen in a lot of cases. But we have to think about like what was the purpose of these metrics when they came out? And that's why DORA publishes new reports every year just to keep up with how things are evolving. But those 4 key metrics have stayed the same as sort of like the benchmarkable gold standard for measuring software delivery capabilities. In 2021, Nicole Forsgren, along with Dr. Margaret Ann Story from the University of Victoria and a handful of other very, very smart researchers, came together and released the Space Framework of Developer Productivity. This is not in competition with DORA. And in a lot of ways, we can see it as a continuation of the research that DORA started and continues to do. Because what Space tried to answer, and actually what Space answers, is what are the different dimensions of developer productivity? It can't just be about like how many PRs Ned closed today or how many commits Kyler committed. Work in progress, work in progress, work in progress. Like, yep, your metrics are great. It has to be more than activity metrics. And so what are the other dimensions? We've got satisfaction and well-being, performance, activity, which is of course important, communication, collaboration, and then efficiency and flow. And only by looking at all of those together can we really make a judgment about whether our organizations are productive or not. Because productivity, surprisingly, we don't have a definition that everyone knows about.
Huh.
The downfall of Space by design, it is a guiding framework. So like DORA, for example, where's the page here in Accelerate, but it gives you the 4 metrics to measure. Everyone measures the same 4 metrics and you get benchmarks. You know if you're like elite, high, medium, low. Space is not like that at all.
Okay.
Space is saying, hey, make sure you're looking at satisfaction and well-being, but also performance, and also look at activity. But it doesn't tell you what to track. It doesn't tell you what to measure. It's more like, here's your mental model. Make sure that you are, looking at these different dimensions. So like in an enterprise environment, when you have a lot of stakeholders, deploying Space can be a really, really heavy lift because it's not prescriptive, it's not benchmarkable. And like a lot of it depends, and you need to come up with the answer. And so that's where Space is such a fantastic framework, such fantastic research, but operationally can be a little bit challenging. And that's sort of like the disadvantage of it. DevEx framework is, again, same research team, kind of as a common thread, but they wanted to look at, okay, organizations that do perform really well, what are the qualities and characteristics of the teams that are performing well? And we found that, reducing cognitive load, very good for developer experience, leads to better outcomes, organizationally, team-wide, and individual outcomes. Improving the frequency of feedback loops, which is what DevOps is all about in a lot of ways, both feedback loops from people and feedback loops from computers and robots and CI builds and whatever. Reduce and have quick feedback loops. And then also flow state. So let people concentrate and get into uninterrupted time for work.
Hmm.
The tricky part of this is like, again, there was some guidance about what to measure, but these things are pretty comparatively squishy when you compare it to like the DORA metrics, right? And it's a really hard sell in a boardroom.
Mm.
Because if you imagine like a new CRO comes like, or head salesperson is like, yeah, we're going to measure the efficacy and performance of our sales organization by sales experience. It just doesn't translate well. And I think already developers have a little bit of a reputation of being coddled and, highly paid,
Hmm.
get to do whatever we want. It's technical debt. Just trust us, And sometimes we haven't done ourselves any favors. Like I've been there. I think about some of the things that I've said in my career and I'm like, wow, I'm embarrassed for my past self. But that's kind of the DevEx framework. Is it's really important and it really like points us to the things that actually make a meaningful difference. But again, it's like that strict guidance and then this concept of, okay, well, should it be DevEx? Should it be DORA? Should it be Space? They're not competing with each other. It's all like the same story and different expressions of the same story. And so to kind of firm that up for people, that's what the Core 4 framework kind of was born to do. We wanted to unify the frameworks and give you prescriptive guidance so that the question wasn't, what should I measure? Should I be choosing between DORA and Space and DevEx? But rather, okay, I want to get started yesterday. Cool. Here is everything that you need to do. It's easily deployable. We have templates and stuff so that you can just like do it DIY on your own and like just get started so that you can focus on the harder part of the problem, which is actually using the metrics for change and transformation. That can be a really, really difficult problem.
Are you handcrafting multi-stage pipelines to deploy and manage your infrastructure? I know Kyler is.
Only all the time, deploying EKS, then Kubernetes, then the Kubernetes applications, all with custom glue. I spend hours doing that each week. Everyone's doing that, right, Ned?
Now, based on Spacelift's State of Infrastructure Automation report from this year, you're in good company. Tons of folks are building complex, custom pipelines to deal with their infrastructure, but maybe you don't have to. Spacelift keeps track of all the graphs from your infrastructure as code tools and can even zoom out to understand how those graphs interconnect. Your graph of graphs. You can also enforce policy as code with OPA, detect and remediate drift, and apply consistent controls across your teams and environments.
But Ned, what am I going to do with all this newfound free time?
Get a hobby, I guess? I hear pickling is all the rage. You can start your 14-day free trial at spacelift.io/day-2. That's day-two. And we thank Spacelift for their sponsorship. So it sounds like the core four is more about actual metrics that you can measure and then, make determinations on. What are these key metrics that you've picked out?
Yeah. One of the things that is often like a common objection to developer productivity metrics or using metrics for performance is this fear of gamification and gamifying a system. And one of the ways that we can insulate ourselves from gamification is by creating a system of metrics where everything is holding each other in tension. And DORA is a great example of this. We have things like deployment frequency, but also change failure rate. So you need to look at them together in order to not be gamified. And that was one of the really solid guiding principles about what we were going to include as key metrics in the core four framework. So we have four pillars or dimensions: speed, which is measured by PRs or diffs per engineer on an aggregate team level. We have effectiveness, which is a developer experience index. I saw your eyebrow go up about the diffs per engineer, so let's come back to that because it's very controversial. It's controversial even among the authors. So we'll talk about that. Okay, so speed, diffs per engineer. Effectiveness is a developer experience index. So we want to ask developers, what's your experience with X, Y, Z? Quality, which is our tried and true change failure rate. It's a great metric from DORA. We've included it in there. And then impact, which is something that kind of extends DORA, extends space to a certain extent. And this is an innovation ratio. So how much time are you able to spend on new features versus keeping the lights on, maintenance work, bug work, etc. And so the idea here is like you have to track the four metrics together, never just one, but they're meant to keep each other in tension. So like we want to see higher quality, but not at the expense of developer experience. We want to see more time on innovation, but not slowing down, for example.
Right. And you could over index on innovation and not fix some of the technical debt or bugs that you have in your software.
Totally. So, Core 4 is a great way for organizations to sort of keep a pulse on how they're doing. All of our metrics are similar to DORA, benchmarkable. So, I don't know, maybe we'll do our own like Core 4 state of DevOps report or a state of Core 4 report because, we see how these trends are changing over time as well. But they're great diagnostic metrics to help you figure out, are we trending up or down? How are we doing in relationship to our competition? Where should we make investment? Where are we doing okay? And we just need to maintain our investment, those kinds of questions.
The reason that my eyebrow went up, that was me, by the way, for the folks at home, because the very first measurement that we talked about was how much code you put out. And we talked about earlier in the show, AI makes you produce this tremendous amount of code. That vertical will just go nuts. Like, oh, I'm at 3,000% of what I was a year ago because AI is writing so much more code. And so I'm glad to hear that, of course, you need to measure an aggregate of all the other things, like in the context of how much of this code is, valid, how much of this code introduces bugs that we have to roll back. Certainly we're seeing more. And I have certainly seen systems in place for measuring the impact of AI, the impact of developer assistance tooling that just considers like, how happy are you and how much code do you put out? And that is just certainly not a mature enough model to accurately measure the impact of AI, the impact of code, the impact of you as a developer on the organization. And this one specifically was from like GitHub from Microsoft that was like to measure whether you should buy more Copilot licenses. Just see if your teams are happy. See if all your juniors are happy. Of course they are. They're writing a lot more code. The cognitive load has been shifted. They're thrilled.
Mm-hmm.
So it's great to hear that there's more mature models that measure a broader impact of developers' work.
Yeah. And I think to the point and sort of the eyebrow raise about PRs per engineer, this is very controversial because some of the criticism, which is, very fair, and like we're always interested in having like productive discourse about this, but like, isn't this just a proxy for lines of code? Isn't it just? And like, maybe. And definitely that's, internally among the authors, we had a lot of spirited discussion about like, is this really the right thing to include? And kind of where we landed and why I've changed my mind. I think Abhi, definitely the co-author and my CEO, you'll see him on stage like 3 years ago, just like ripping this metric to shreds. I've definitely spoken publicly about how it's a bad metric on an individual level. But when we look at like individually, it's not very helpful because senior engineers are spending more time maybe reviewing code and junior engineers should be spending more time writing code. Looking at their PR merged number isn't really helpful to determine their impact. But if we look at it aggregated on a team level, it actually can be a really good indicator of friction in the system. Like, can developers get their work done?
Hmm.
If they encounter a lot of friction, finding documentation, waiting for manual sign-offs, like that number is going to be lower. If everything is fully automated and they're practicing like true CD, that number is very high. And so it is a pretty good gauge of friction in the system. I would say it's not a proxy for lines of code because we're taking it one level of abstraction up. And so to your point, Kyler, I think we're writing more code, but I would be curious about, and this is a question that I can answer myself actually, the number of PRs going up or down is an interesting question because like we might be generating more code per PR.
Mhm.
Are we generating more PRs? I think these are really useful thought exercises for the listener at home. If you're thinking about like, okay, what's my prediction or my forecast if we introduce AI? What are some of the ways that we're going to see habits and workflows change? Like that might be one of them. But I guess, sorry, to go back to the why PRs per, like diffs per engineer isn't just lines of code. We wanted to go one level of abstraction up or even two because we don't want to track lines of code. We don't even want to track commits. But a PR is sort of like the lowest, smallest footprint of something that's shippable. We didn't want to measure projects either because that's like too much.
Hmm.
It's like we want to measure the smallest shippable thing. And for many companies, that's what a PR or a merge request or, something else of that granularity is. I don't think lens of code is a good metric. I think it can be interesting to answer specific questions like, are we writing more lines of code now that we have AI coding assistants? I think that's a really good question to ask and a really good reason to look at number of lines of code authored.
It sounds like the counterbalance to pushing too many PRs is the quality measure. So the change failure rate. If you're pushing out a bunch of PRs, but a lot of them are failing in deployment and causing outages, then you want to bring that number down.
And I imagine that through line is difficult to measure, right? So if you have a ton of PRs merged and your failure rate is going up or going down, how do you measure who is causing that? Or specifically what person, team, process, technology, what's causing that failure rate? Like I imagine that's pretty difficult to correlate.
It is, I think change failure rate is one of the most challenging metrics to measure because there's so much ambiguity in its definition to begin with.
Mm.
What's a change?
Mhm.
What's a failure? Surprisingly, we don't really have a standard definition. Of course, there's like the description of it from Accelerate, but a lot of companies, they have their own SLAs and their own definition of what's a P0 versus a P1. Different teams have different like thresholds for what they'll put on degraded service on status page and what they won't. There's all these different things. And so it's like the socio-technical wiring of an organization really impacts your capabilities of calculating these metrics.
Mhm.
Many teams, if you're small enough, can get most of the way there by looking at your status page or like hooking into PagerDuty, for example, hooking into your telemetry and being able to like, say, okay, well, this deployment went out here. It was this PR, it failed. And then there's the question of like, okay, well, if it's an automatic rollback, is that a failure? And which I don't think so. It's not degraded service for your customer. Your systems are working as expected, as designed. And so we get into all this different nuance here, depending on what your data source is. Truly, the best way to measure change failure rate, which is the way that DORA does it, which is ask the question for the primary service or application that you work on, what percentage of changes in the last week or last month resulted in degraded service for your customers that required you to push out a hot fix or a patch immediately to restore service?
Right.
I can tell you that 'Cause humans are really good like, we're so good at taking all of this data from all these different sources and contextualizing it and, like, making a decision about things, like, super quick, right? That's what intuition is. It's like, gut feelings are just it's just data. But that's really difficult to try to get all that context from all these disparate tools that you need, like Rollbar, like all your telemetry, whatever, incident management, PagerDuty, Incident IO, whatever it is you're using, and trying to put together that story when the developers themselves, since these metrics are like, especially change failure rate is targeting a team or a service, you can ask the people who are responsible for it and they can probably tell you just really quickly what that number is.
Mhm.
It's hard problems.
They definitely are, and they're different in each organization. So it's fascinating hearing about different ways to study it and standardize it amongst all the organizations, all the DevOps collectives everywhere. It's fascinating. And I know you've been writing about this. You have been working on something that will be releasing. Do you want to tell us about your book?
Yeah. So, one of my missions, I guess, in life, in the world, is to help engineering leaders use data like the core four, like DORA metrics, to make better decisions for their engineering teams. The problem necessarily isn't that the lack of data, like we've got data all around us. The problem is standardizing it, interpreting it, figuring out what to do so that our teams look at it. And so, I'm working on this book called Data Driven, which is kind of an engineering leader's playbook for getting your engineering organization, your engineering teams to become more fluent with data and to use data in everyday decisions. So it's covering everything from kind of organizational design when it comes to developer experience initiatives to beating Goodhart's law to DORA metrics space, kind of going over all these different frameworks that we've mentioned today. So right now I'm writing it. So if you want to kind of follow along the journey, we'll leave a link to sign up for updates. I think in the show notes here, you can sign up to our mailing list and get more information. We're doing some pre-release chapters for beta readers as they become available, just in time rendering of that. So yeah, it's really exciting. It's definitely hard work, but I think really important work. So I'm excited to get it out into the world.
That sounds like a pretty fascinating book.
Mhm.
I'm looking forward to that, and I know that writing a book is no small undertaking, so good for you for doing that. Woo, wow.
That sounds fascinating. I want to buy that book and put it next to Accelerate on my bookshelf. But because I know most of our listeners are on like DevOps, platform engineering teams, developer experience teams, how will this book relate to them? How can they use this book to make their organizations better?
Well, I think platform engineering teams benefit so greatly from frameworks like DORA, from Space, DevEx, from the Core 4. And a lot of what I'm going to be writing about in the book is directly relevant to platform engineering teams, DevOps teams, if that's, the language you use to describe yourself. Because the truth of the matter is that platform engineering teams often have a really hard road of proving impact and proving ROI of the work that they're doing because it's for an internal customer. It's not so easy to kind of trace it back to revenue. But with a metrics framework like the Core 4, what you can do is get a baseline and then you can understand adoption. You can understand how tools have changed workflows. You can talk about time loss and do some calculations of ROI. This really helps platform engineering teams sort of justify, and I don't love to use that word, but justify the decisions that they've made and helps them really advocate to continue pushing for their initiatives and everything that comes with it, including funding, executive sponsorship. So, everyone that's working on this comes from a platform engineering, DevOps. Like I was an infrastructure engineer. That's really our background. And so a lot of what we're doing is like we're thinking about those platform engineers first and foremost and building tooling to help that particular persona.
That sounds wonderful. This has been so fun to have you on here. This has been so fascinating. And I definitely want to buy both of these books now and catch up. For folks that want to learn more about Core 4, more about you, follow you for updates on your book, where can they find you on the big bad internet?
Find me on LinkedIn. It's usually where I'm hanging out now since Twitter's no fun anymore. And I just didn't replace it with anything else because I was like, you know what? I'm just going to give myself some peace. So please follow me on LinkedIn. I'm posting quite frequently there. You can DM me if you have a question, or you can read my blog, lauratacho.com. I'm also writing some blog posts and doing some webinars at getdx.com as well about developer productivity, platform engineering, Core 4 framework, and lots of other good stuff.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Had a great time.
Thank you so much to Laura Tacho for appearing on Day 2 DevOps, and virtual high fives to you, dear listener, for tuning in. If you have suggestions for future shows, we would love to hear them. Really, we really would. Hit Hit either of us up on LinkedIn or send some feedback via packetpushers.net/follow-up. You can find me, Kyler Middleton, blogging over on letsdodevops.com and my stupendous co-host, Ned Bellavance at nedinthecloud.com. And we're both terminally active on LinkedIn. Stop by and say hello. If you like engineering-oriented shows like this one, visit packetpushers.net/subscribe. All of our podcasts, newsletters, and websites are there. It's all nerdy content designed for your professional career development. Until next time, just remember that doing DevOps is awesome, and so are you.